I boarded the bus in Atlanta and sat as close to the rear as possible. Normally, I'm a real friendly kind of guy and don't mind striking up conversation with total strangers, but at this point in my life, I was one of the most wanted men in the country. My face was plastered on the front page of newspapers, and I couldn't risk one of the other passengers recognizing me. The bus drove through the night. Our destination was Tallahassee, Florida. My plan was to get as far away from Colorado as possible. The authorities there had seen fit to charge me with the murder of a young nurse named Karen Campbell. My legal advisors had assured me that the case against me was weak at best, but I didn't want to take any chances. I had already been found guilty of kidnapping and assaulting another young woman. Should I be found guilty on this charge also, I was looking at the prospect of spending the rest of my life behind bars. The way I saw it, I only had one option: escape. My first dash at freedom was impulsive more than anything. On June 7, 1977, I was taken to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. As a former law student, I felt confident enough to act as my own attorney. Some people might see this as a little arrogant, but I've always been good at persuading people, of making them see things from my point of view. During a recess in the hearing, I asked to use the courthouse library. A guard brought me up. Real nice fella, very friendly. At one point he stepped out for a cigarette or something, and I thought to myself, it's now or never. I went over to the window and looked outside. It was roughly 30 feet to the ground below. The drop seemed high enough to hurt a person, but probably too short to kill them, so long as you didn't land on your head or something. I hit the ground hard, hurting my ankle. There was no time to feel sorry for myself, though. The second I jumped from that window, I was a fugitive. I knew that time wasn't on my side. Once the guard noticed that I was gone, there would be roadblocks all over Aspen. With no car to make a quick escape and limping on a sprained ankle, I made for Aspen Mountain. I can't begin to tell you how hard it is to hike up a mountain with a sprained ankle, but my thirst for freedom spurred me on. Eventually, I came across a little cabin near the summit of the mountain. Thankfully, there was nobody inside. I spent the night in the cabin, grateful for the shelter and also the clothing and food that I found. If not for the cabin, there's a good chance that I would have frozen to death on that mountain. The next day, I tried to hike down the mountain and into the town of Crested Butte. Unfortunately, I'm not much of a hiker, and I ended up spending 2 days wandering around aimlessly on Aspen Mountain. On June 10th, with no other options before me, I made my way back to Aspen. By now, my escape was a cause célèbre amongst the good residents of Aspen. I later heard about a local restaurant that was selling a Bundy burger, which was actually nothing more than a plain roll. The restaurant had a sign out front that read, "Open it and see that the meat has fled." For 3 days I managed to avoid the cops in Aspen, but my luck ran out when I drove straight into a roadblock while driving a car that I had borrowed without the owner's permission. I was taken back to jail in Glenwood Springs. The judge in my trial wasn't too pleased with my escape, nor was the guard who was supposed to be keeping an eye on me in the library. Last I heard, the poor fellow was suspended, but other than that, I don't know what became of him. My dash at freedom had been an abject failure. I was back behind bars, but more worryingly, I now looked guilty as hell. I'd pleaded my innocence in the Karen Campbell case to anybody who would listen, but there's an old mantra that says, "Innocent men don't run." Naturally, I once more began to plot my escape. Given my reputation in Aspen, I reckoned that there was no chance that I could ever get a fair trial there. So, I petitioned the judge and asked him to change the location. I was pleasantly surprised when he agreed to do so, but more than a little dismayed when he decided to change the location to Colorado Springs, a jurisdiction that was notorious for passing death sentences. The way I looked at it, I was no longer just on trial for my freedom. I was on trial for my life. I had to get out. I had to get as far away from Colorado as I possibly could. My new cell in Garfield County Jail was supposedly maximum security, but where there's a will, there is a way. I was determined to get out, and on the night of December 30th, that's exactly what I did. In the weeks leading up to my second escape, I had practically starved myself. I managed to lose roughly 20 pounds and was little more than a bag of bones. I had been able to saw a little hole in the roof of my cell. I knew that on the night of the 30th, there would only be a skeleton crew on shift at the jail. After arranging some books on my bed and covering them with the blanket, so as to give the impression that I was still present and sound asleep, I shimmied into the roof space. From there, I climbed down into an office. There, I found some clothes and quickly got changed. Wearing non-prison issue clothing was obviously a prerequisite to my making a successful getaway. 17 hours later, the guards noticed that I was gone. By then I was in Chicago, a little over 1,000 miles away. From there, I took a train to Michigan. I stayed in the city of Ann Arbor for 5 days before borrowing a car and driving south to Atlanta. I was as free as a bird, but one can never be too safe when it comes to avoiding the long arm of the law, and so I boarded a bus for Florida. On the morning of January 8th, I arrived in Tallahassee. I was ready to start a new chapter in my life. There was every chance that the law would never find me here. Not ever. Shortly after I arrived in Florida, I made my way to a construction site and asked for some work. I had to abandon that plan, though, when the foreman asked to see some ID. It seemed that escaping my past would prove to be more difficult than I imagined. Escaping my true nature, though, would prove to be impossible. On the night of Saturday, January 14th, 1978, I made my way to a nightclub called Narrates. It was popular with local college students, and more importantly, it sat right next to a female sorority house, Chi Omega. It had been so long since I had experienced the thrill of the kill. To me, the sight of the Chi Omega house was like a starving man suddenly finding himself seated at an exquisite banquet. I don't profess to have ever had much self-control in my life. If I had, then the world never would have heard of me. I loitered around Sherrod's for a while. Several young women danced the night away, with me watching their every move. Eventually, I convinced a young woman named Mary Ann to dance with me. I could tell that she was uncomfortable, though, and I wasn't really in the mood to give her any of the old Bundy charm. Most of my previous kills had required me to be as suave as possible, but not tonight. At around midnight, I watched the girl I danced with and her friends leave Sherrod's. I could have sworn that I saw them enter the Chi Omega house via the rear, but I would later learn that in actual fact, they had parked their car there earlier that evening and had left the scene altogether. It didn't really matter, though. There were still plenty of young women inside the Chi Omega house, and I had each and every one of them in my sights. In the early hours of the morning, I made my way to the rear of the Chi Omega. It was deathly quiet. Getting inside the house was child's play, but I needed a suitable weapon. I scanned the area and quickly settled on a wooden log. That would do just fine. I crept inside the house and paused for a moment. There was no activity at all. Everybody was sound asleep, I reckoned. Given the number of women inside the house, it wasn't unfathomable to think that there might be a witness who lived to tell the tale. So I wore a pantyhose mask, just in case. After making my way inside, I crept to the stairs and ever so slightly began tiptoeing up to the second floor. It's difficult for me to explain the mixture of excitement and sheer, undiluted rage that I was feeling as I entered the first bedroom. That is, it's difficult for me to explain just how potent my rage was, and almost impossible for me to explain the source of that rage. The young woman was sound asleep in her bed. There was no need to trick her, charm her, or persuade her, as had so often been the case with many of my previous victims. She was utterly defenseless. I brought the log down hard upon her head before strangling her with a stocking. My bloodlust was not satisfied, though. Rather than fleeing into the night, I made my way to another bedroom. Once more, I found a young woman sleeping in her bed. Still pumped up from my first kill just moments earlier, I was more animal than man by now. I even went so far as to bite my second victim on several areas of her body, something that I would later come to regret when the bite marks were used against me in open court. When I entered the third bedroom, I hesitated for a moment when I saw that two girls were present. Even more worryingly, One of them appeared to be awake and staring right at me. I hit her first. The commotion must have awoken the other girl in the room, as she began to stir also. Naturally, I then attacked her with the wooden log. The first girl was still alive, and so I turned my attention back to her. But just as I raised the log high above my head and prepared to deliver the fatal blow, the entire room suddenly lit up. The darkness evaporated in an instant, and for the first time since I entered the Chi Omega house, fear became my dominant emotion. It turned out that the light was from a car's headlights. One of the girls who lived in the house was returning from a date. Who returns from a date at that time of the night? Spooked and cursing my bad luck, I fled the house. I'd brutally assaulted 4 women in the space of less than 15 minutes, but I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. I made my way stealthily from the Chi Omega house, staying in the shadows and still choking with rage that I had been interrupted whilst there. There is little doubt in my own mind that if that girl returning from her date hadn't disturbed me, I would have paid a visit to every single bedroom in the Chi Omega. I mean, what else would have stopped me? Nothing could satisfy my bloodlust that night. Throwing all caution to the wind, I was determined to kill again. It didn't take long for me to zero in on a potential target. I came across this little duplex apartment, and upon noticing that a rear window was open, I clambered inside one of the apartments. Finding myself in a kitchen, I crept to a bedroom and was overjoyed to find a young woman. She was fast asleep, and perhaps just as importantly, she was all alone. I was confident enough to take off my mask, but as I began to attack the woman lying on the bed, bludgeoning her just as I had the others back at the Chi Omega house, something inexplicable happened. The phone on the woman's bedside began to ring. I was incredulous. It must have been around 4 in the morning. Who could possibly be calling at this hour? Remembering that I was just a few blocks away from the Chi Omega house, I wondered whether by now the police had arrived over there and were perhaps calling nearby residents, warning them that some lunatic was loose and on the rampage. I fled the scene, not sure whether or not the woman I had just attacked was still alive or not. In my panic, I forgot my pantyhose mask, leaving it behind for the cops to find. I would later learn that 2 other women in the apartment next door had heard the commotion and, sensing that something was wrong, had called their friend's room to see if she was okay. When nobody answered the phone, they called 911. It turned out that the woman was a dance student named Cheryl Thomas. She would survive her encounter with me, but she suffered with issues with regard to her equilibrium for the rest of her life, putting an end to her dance career. After escaping from Colorado and making my way to Florida, I probably could have made a new life for myself, but my urge to kill was too ingrained in my nature for this to happen. By now, it was only a matter of time before the law caught up with me, but that's a story for another day.